I know people are still joining us, so I'll be letting people in from the waiting room as we get started this morning. First of all, thank you so much for being here. I know how busy y'all are, and I so appreciate you for taking this time to be with us this morning. We're going to go ahead and get started so that we can use your time as efficiently as possible. We'll start on time so that we can end on time and y'all can get back to your schools and your day. Let me start by reintroducing myself. I recognize a lot of faces from last time, but in case you're new to our learning series, my name is Rebecca Dye. People call me Becca, so please call me that. I'm coming to you today from a much warmer than last week, Austin, Texas. We have thawed out. My family was very lucky. We had power the whole time, we had water the whole time, and our neighborhood was kind of a mess and not so lucky, but we are doing okay, and it is going to be 80 degrees today. So you just never know what's going to happen over here in Texas. I live here with my husband, Alex, and our two kids, 3-year-old Julian, 1-year-old Tyler. I have been in elementary education for 12 years, and the work we're doing together is especially important to me because I believe that all children deserve a choice-filled life, and we know in order for that to happen, they must be proficient readers and writers. We know that all kids can learn to read and write with high quality, systematic foundational skills instruction. And so I'm especially excited about what we're going to be focusing on during this learning series so that we can open those doors for all of the students that we serve. Again, here's our 4-part learning series. Last time we worked to define our approach to unfinished teaching and learning of foundational reading skills. This time we are thinking about how we assess and diagnose unfinished teaching and learning of foundational reading skills. Next time we'll go a bit deeper with some of the work we're starting today by thinking about how we actually respond to that data and get kids exactly what they need to be able to bring them into grade level instruction so that they can really access what they should be learning now. And then finally, in our last session, we'll start thinking about the older learners we have in our schools who are still struggling to read and write and most likely still have gaps in foundational skills. So let's get started by thinking about the self-assessment that I gave to y'all as we were finishing up last time. We're gonna zoom into the second section of that self-assessment and the teaching and learning section, and we're really gonna think about the questions that get at assessing mastery of skills and how we use assessments in our schools. So let's take a look at questions 7 and 8 from the second section, and let's start to think about what our current assessment practices look at in our schools, and to what extent they are informing teachers in how they identify and address unfinished learning in the students in our classrooms. So we're going to take about 2 minutes just to think on our own, and I'll chat out this self-assessment in just a second one more time in case you don't have it. And then in the chat or by coming off mute, let's share out the answers to these questions that are on the screen. What do the current assessment practices look like in our own school? How are our teachers using assessment, or to what extent are they using the assessments to identify and address All right, so either in the chat or by coming off mute, let's start to share out our thoughts. These can be quick reflections, just a word or two, a sentence or two. Let's bring it back to our own schools.
I would say that for our school, they are ongoing, frequent checks for understanding.
Awesome. We're going to talk a lot about that. So that's a great thing to already have in place at your school. Awesome. I see at some of our schools, we have a two-pronged approach. We have the assessments that really align to what we're teaching, and also more normed assessments for like nationally normed assessments to see in the broader picture where our students are. Awesome. I have not ever seen Amira. I've heard a lot about it. I've heard the teachers love it and schools love it. Very cool. Okay, let's keep moving. Could I have someone come off mute to read our objectives for us today?
I can do it. Participants will explain the critical role of assessment of early literacy skills for identification of unfinished learning and equity, recognize best practices and potential pitfalls in the assessment of early literacy skills, examine best practice in data analysis practices, reflect on current assessment practices, and develop an action plan.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Kyla. And Chrissy, thank you so much for getting your voice in the space already this morning. We're going to have lots of opportunities to talk with each other. So I'm excited. We're already getting going. Here's what we're going to be doing today. We're almost all the way through our getting started section. We're going to have a short time where we will get on the same page and have a common definition for all of the assessments we're talking about, what the best practices are, and what some pitfalls might be. We're going to spend the bulk of our time looking into case studies and seeing an example and a non-example of assessment best practices. We'll do some actual data analysis of some sample data. And then we'll do a quick wrap up, learn what the next steps are before we head out of here. Again, our quick Zoom norms. First and foremost, please be present. Please turn your camera on as much as possible. We all know you are in your schools or in your homes where there might be other people coming in and out. That is totally fine. If you feel comfortable and able, please keep your camera on. And also, we totally understand if you need to turn your camera off. Please keep your audio on mute, as you all are, until you're ready to come off mute and speak, and then put yourself back on mute. We're going to have lots of opportunities to engage with each other during this session. So please share your thoughts in the chat. Please come off of mute when I ask you to, and then we'll have some breakout sessions also, where we'll get to work in smaller groups to analyze data, talk about how things are going. And I'm always excited about those times because we'll get to learn from each other, learn from colleagues across the state. And I think that's just such a great opportunity. Please use the chat feature when prompted. I will work to address your questions in the chat also and stay engaged with y'all in the session. So know if I haven't addressed your question, it's just because I'm going to get to it in a little bit. And if I don't, please send it back to me. I will chat out the materials for our note catcher in just a second, and then you'll be able to make a copy of that. It will be yours in your drive. So put your name on it, mark it up as you want, because it is all yours. And then finally, this one didn't quite make it onto the slide, but as always, when we are learning together, it's important for us to create and maintain that safe space for professional learning. We have people coming in from all across their learning trajectories as educators, and it's important for us to assume the best of each other as we learn together. So please just keep that in mind as we're going through our session today. And then again, this is a short session, just an hour and a half. Please take care of yourself as you need, and then re-engage with us just as quickly as possible. In just a second, I'm going to drop this link for our note catcher. Go ahead and click on it. It'll take you to a make a copy page. Click on make a copy, and then that is yours. It's in your drive, so please save it in a place where you can access it again. It'll have links to things that we'll need. It'll have our case studies and our data set. So make sure you have access to that. And then when you do, give me a thumbs up so I know we are ready to keep moving. Great, I'm seeing most people have access to their note catcher, so we'll keep going. All right, so let's dig into the content here. We're going to start by thinking about assessment best practices. These are general best practices with assessments. Then we'll take a look at these best practices through a few case studies. It's important for us to understand that as we think about assessment, the purpose of assessment is to determine how we bring our students into grade level instruction. Not whether we're going to or if it's appropriate, but it's what are the gaps that our kids have. That's what the assessments are showing us. And then how can we address those gaps so that we can bring kids into the grade level content that will allow them to be successful in school and in life. I know we just went over our norms a quick second ago, but I really want us to bring us back to that create and maintain that safe space for learning and approach this session as a learner. For some of us, going over these types of assessments and their purposes is going to be old news, things you've thought about for years, and for some it might be new. So if you're in that first category, please take this as a refresher. We will move through it pretty quickly so that we can get into more interactive learning. So there are three types of assessments that we're really going to dive into today that are critical for supporting students as a way to bring them into grade level learning. We're going to start with a brief overview of those three types, and then we'll go into them a little bit more in depth. The first type of assessment is diagnostic assessment. We know it's important to administer those diagnostic assessments at the beginning of the year and then periodically throughout the year for us to really take stock on where our kids are, what they know and what they don't know based on what we've already taught them, and then what gaps they have and what gaps we need to address to bring them into grade level learning. Next, we'll use formative assessments. It sounds like many of our schools are doing that. That's what Chrissy was sharing about before. We'll use formative assessments often to see how kids are progressing through the grade level skills we're teaching, if they are mastering that content, and then what we need to reteach and continue to assess to ensure that our kids are gaining mastery of those skills so that they can move on to the next skills. We know that foundational skills are sequential. So if we have big gaps in the earlier skills, they won't be able to access the on grade level skills as well. And then finally, progress monitoring, which allows us to ensure that students are continuing towards mastery. In older grades, this might look like giving fluency assessments to make sure that they are able to fluently read. the texts that we are giving them, which points to having a solid base of foundational skills. If not, it probably means there is a gap in the foundational skills, and we might need to do some more assessment to see what the true problems are. We'll also look at some summative assessments, some summative unit assessments later in our case study. And I'll talk about that more when we get there. We'll use those to, again, see what the gaps are that our students have and who we really need to target with instruction to ensure that they are able to access the grade level content. I want to name again here, these names of assessments, people have different definitions of them, slightly different definitions of them all over the place. So let's use these working definitions. If it doesn't quite match yours, know that we're coming from all over the state and even a different state in my case. And so I wanted to name these in the beginning just to make sure that we're all on the same page about what we're talking about today. So let's dive into diagnostic assessment a bit more. Diagnostic assessments are used to identify the missed teaching and learning or learning that is not yet finished. In our last session, when we looked at Ms. Boudreau's example, we saw that she used diagnostic assessment in the beginning of the year to see which kids were coming into her classroom already with gaps. We'll use those in the beginning of the year and then periodically just to make sure we're not missing things in those formative assessments or missing gaps that our students might be getting along the way. It's important to give these assessments because we can't make assumptions about what students know and what they don't know. You might be finding this year or thinking ahead to next year, these types of assessments are going to be especially important because we've had so many interruptions in learning or kids who might not have been in our schools for an entire year and have been in virtual learning. We'll use these assessments to see what gaps do our kids have, or are there students who it seems like weren't super engaged in virtual learning, but actually got a lot out of it and are further ahead than we expect, which is best case scenario, I know, and maybe not what we're expecting, but we might have some of that also. Could I have a participant come off mute and read this quote about formative assessments for us?
Oh, I will. Formative assessments are our jam. Assessment must occur as close to instruction as possible and in the mode in which it will provide most meaningful guidance. The point of assessment in this use case isn't to generate data about what, in this case, isn't to generate data about what students get right or wrong. It's to understand how to support students as they work.
Thanks so much, Mark. And I think there is a typo in this slide that I'll definitely have to fix before my next session. Yes, let's take a minute to reflect on how this recommendation is similar or different to how you approach assessment at your school. It sounds like we're doing tons of formative assessment all the time, which is so important in foundational skills. So that's awesome. Here is a huge list of best practices for formative assessments. We know that that checks for understandings or formative assessments should be used to celebrate and capitalize on strengths. They should be used to identify how students are progressing with learning and how they can apply grade level skills independently and accurately. We can use these checks for understandings to inform if adjustments to instructional approaches are needed, like if most kids are not mastering the content, do we need to adjust how we're teaching? Or is it a small group of students that need remediation or reteach? And who those students are. I also know that I've used the term progress monitoring in this in the same way before, and maybe you have too. We really are monitoring the progress of our students throughout their learning and throughout the year, not just waiting for those diagnostic points or the summative assessment points to see how our kids are doing. And then finally, let's think about progress monitoring. We can think about progress monitoring in the older grades as the foundational skills should already be solidified, where we give periodic assessments of fluency with grade level text so that we can see if students are able to read those texts fluently. Are they able to read them with appropriate accuracy, rate, and expression? That will point us towards them having strong foundational skills. And if not, it will show us maybe there's a gap that they have from the earlier grades that needs to be addressed, even when they're in the older grades, where we don't focus on foundational skills quite as much. We know that the data can be collected through fluency assessments, but also through listening to kids read, maybe an independent reading book, or in choral reading, or in a paired reading section of their instruction already. So this can happen in a formal way, but also informally too. Okay, now that we have briefly gone over these three main types of assessments, we are going to dive into our case studies and some more interactive learning together. We are going to have our tale of two classrooms again. We love this model. We will look at Mr. Landry and Miss Williams and how they use assessments in their classrooms and at their schools. As in our first session with Mr. Monroe, in our non-example, I know that some of us have engaged in these practices. I sure know that I have in the schools that I've worked in for a variety of reasons. Again, I want to highlight that we are using these case studies and this learning experience as a know better, do better stance. As you're reading and learning more, let's take a moment to acknowledge how these practices can improve. And as we're learning more, think about how can we tweak the practices in our own schools to make assessments a little bit more meaningful for our teachers and therefore our students. So we will analyze and discuss Mr. Landry's example as our non-example. Then we'll really dive into Miss Williams' example and even go through a data meeting that might happen at her school to pick out some of those best practices and see how some really in-depth analysis points her in the direction of meeting her students' needs even better. So let's start with Mr. Landry. This is the first thing you'll see in your guided notes or in your note catcher. We're going to take 5 minutes to read Mr. Landry's example, and then we'll come back together to share out in the chat and also over audio what we saw in his school and in his classroom that do not align to best practices in assessments. So 5 minutes, and then I'll bring us back together. All right, so as you're finishing up your reading in the chat or by coming off mute, let's go ahead and share out our reflections. What do we see in Mr. Landry's school and in his classroom that do not align to best practices in assessment? Yeah, I see what Kathy called out there. So important, publicly posting students as red, yellow, and green, and then keeping those categories for an entire semester, not used for instruction, but just for labeling, which is definitely not a best practice. He's collecting data, but not really to use it, just for compliance, so that he has the grades for the grade book, he has the grades to show to his school leader or his instructional coach. Yeah, but not really to instruct kids. Awesome. Thanks so much for those reflections. Here's some of what I pulled out ahead of time, basically what y'all already said. These assessments are being used for compliance and for labeling students, but not really to move students or to meet them with the needs that they have. There's no ongoing collection of data that aligns with instruction. And so he's not getting any information about what kids are learning or not learning based on their foundational skills instruction. We are taking spelling test data just to send home and just so parents get a grade, but not really, again, to best instruct kids. Awesome. So I really just want to drive home the point here, which we've already talked about a lot today, but we're not using, the purpose of assessment is not to be a gatekeeper to grade level learning. It's really for us as teachers to see what our kids need to get them into the grade level learning so they can master grade level appropriate skills and be proficient readers and writers for school and for life. These assessments will give us better information so that we can be better teachers for our students. Awesome. Let's now dive into our example. We'll look at Miss Williams and her team's approach to assessment to see some best practices. As with all exemplar case studies, this might seem like exactly what you're doing at your school, and that's amazing, or it might seem like the furthest thing from your school, and that's a reality too. If you are somewhere like the latter example or somewhere in the middle, our goal isn't to read this case study and say, okay, let's do this all tomorrow. It's for us to think, what are some tweaks we can make to our practices? What are some things we're doing that aren't really helping? And how can we tweak that to get a little bit closer to the exemplar so that if we make that tweak, get our teachers there, get our kids there, we can make another tweak and get closer and closer to the exemplar. So we're gonna take about 5 minutes again with Miss Williams and her team. And as we read her example, we're gonna think about what in this case study aligns to the best practices in assessment. After that, we will get to engage in the data meeting that her and her team will have, analyze some data and see how it is used to really powerfully target the right instruction for the kids that need it most. So again, I'll set 5 minutes on my timer, go ahead and read her example, and then I'll bring us back together to share out. All right, let's come back together. I see people are already chatting out what they saw that were best practices from Miss Williams' school in her classroom. And if anybody wants to come off mute to voice over what they put in the chat, or just to come off mute instead of putting something in the chat, that would be great too. Great, we see there's constant monitoring of students aligned to what they are learning in their classroom, so we can see what the gaps are in relation to what they've been taught. They use the diagnostic data from the beginning of the year to already get an idea of what the gaps are in their students. Great. Here are a couple of the things that I pulled out ahead of time also. Exactly what y'all already pulled out. There's just constant data being collected, both in student work and in more formal types of assessments, but also through anecdotal notes and observational checklists. Great. We also recognize that all of the materials are aligned. They all are part of the core materials from the high quality curriculum that they use at her school, which is so important, and sort of like what we talked about last time in our case of two schools with Mr. Monroe and Miss Boudreaux. Great. All right, so now we are going to get into the data meeting from Miss Williams' school. Let's take 1 minute to go to the next page of your note catcher and go ahead and review the agenda for the data meeting at their school. We're gonna reflect on your thoughts on this agenda. No need to share them out just yet. We'll have lots of time to share about the data meeting in just a minute. So 1 minute to read the agenda and reflect on how does this approach currently align to what you are doing at your school? What are your thoughts on this agenda? And then we'll move to the next thing. One thing that I noticed when I was first looking at this agenda was this agenda is so universal. We can use it for the end of Unit 2 assessment data. We could use it for a checklist that she's collected on her students. We could use it for looking at student work. There's just so many ways that we could use the same agenda over and over so that we're not trying to reinvent the wheel each week with how we're looking at data, which I think is so helpful to teachers so they can start just doing this on their own or doing this thinking as they're collecting their data, and helpful to us as the leaders at schools so we're not scrambling to create something new each week. Okay, so now we're going to walk through the data meeting process using a set of data that is made up. It's not from any school. We created it so that we can experience the level of detail that Miss Williams and her colleagues use to analyze data in order to make instructional approach shifts so that they can best meet the needs of all of their students. The data we're going to use is from a first grade Unit 2 CKLA assessment. And again, it's a mock set of data for Ms. Williams' class. We are using the CKLA data, but again, this could be used for any assessment, or any assessment that's aligned to the curriculum that you're using at your school, whether it's CKLA or not. So let's learn a little bit about this assessment that we're going to be using. The Unit 2 assessment is an end of unit assessment. So it is a summative assessment in that we are not circling back to these skills in a later unit. So this is the students will not be taught these skills again in their core curriculum. We know that foundational skills are sequential, so we need to analyze this data to be able to address any gaps that are coming out of the unit so that we can address them and they will be able to access the instruction in the later units. We should also analyze this data for trends in student outcomes, and also to determine the effectiveness of our delivery of instruction. So are we teaching and our kids aren't quite grasping it? Is that part of the problem? I don't want us to get tripped up on the word summative here. While it's true, these skills won't be addressed again in CKLA. We know, like I said, that these skills must be addressed before kids will be able to move forward and gain access to the later foundational skills. So the first part of the assessment is a word recognition section. This measures their proficiency with the letter patterns that were taught in this unit. Then they were asked to read a decodable text and answer comprehension questions based on that decodable text. We know that the decodable text only uses patterns that have been previously taught. So while this may seem like a comprehension assessment, it will point to the gaps that students may have in their ability to decode in context based on what they've already learned. In this part of the assessment, and we'll really look into this in depth as we're analyzing the data, I want to point out that if a kid scores really poorly on this comprehension assessment, we can then go back and assess their ability to decode words with these spelling patterns to make sure that it's a decoding issue and not something else, because we know that it could be that they can decode the words and they have a comprehension issue somewhere else that we need to address. And then finally, there's a grammar assessment of this, a grammar portion of this assessment. While grammar is not a foundational skill, it's a language skill, we wanted to look into this data to also try and identify trends in the class and how instruction is going. So now we're going to walk through the data meeting process. We know that by doing this, we will get a better understanding of what Ms. Williams and her school engages in and how they best meet the needs of their students. We are going to start first with bullet point 2, determining students' needs. So in just a minute, we're going to head into breakout rooms to start this type of data analysis. We're going to use the guidance on our note catcher to identify where students have met the level of proficiency and where they have not. What you see on the slide is the same data, it just doesn't have those cutoff points for what CKLA considers meeting expectations and what they don't. So if you look into your note catcher, we'll see, for example, that for reading, diagraphs, and spellings, getting 12 out of 15 or above is considered proficient. So we're going to go through each column and identify where students have met proficiency, where they have not, and what trends we're seeing. So for example, if we look in the reading, diagraphs, and spellings, and we head down to Noah, we'll see that he scored 11 out of 15, which does not meet proficiency. So I would mark that on my spreadsheet. We're going to spend about 15 minutes in our breakout rooms. There'll be 3 to 4 people. This is a time for y'all to identify the trends in the data and then start to analyze them together, talk about what you see and what you can start to notice for what's happening in this classroom. Then we'll come back together and we'll share out what we've noticed. I'm gonna pop into the breakout rooms briefly. No need to disrupt your conversation. I can answer questions if you have them, or I will join your conversation for a bit and then head to the next breakout room. Okay, so I'm going to get these breakout rooms ready and we will head over there in just a minute. You can go ahead and start looking at this data on your own for this brief moment.
Hey, Becca, we just sent you a message in chat.
I saw it. I will make that happen. Okay, I'm going to send you into your breakout rooms now. If there's a problem, please send me a message or come back and I can help out. And I'll see you in about 15 minutes. Taylor, I just noticed that I didn't put you in it because I didn't see your name in that list. Let me move you over to that group. I should have just sent you, yes.
Yeah, like is there a percentage?
Are you, do you see, I just put you in room 2. Do you see that? No. Yeah? Okay.
I pushed the wrong button and got myself out of my break room too early, right mid-sentence.
No worries. We're all going to be back here in just a minute.
I know. I wanted to find out one more piece of information.
Oh, well, we are going to go back into breakout rooms again. So hold your thought.
Okay. Are we going back to the same breakout room?
Mhm.
Okay, good.
Okay, I believe everybody is back. So let's keep moving with our discussion. Okay. All right, so before we move on to our next piece of the data meeting, I wanted to hear some of the reflections y'all had in your big breakout groups. I was definitely able to hear some awesome conversations as I popped around into different groups. So if you could either in the chat or by coming off mute, share what did y'all talk about? What were your main takeaways from this data set?
One of the things that we talked about where when we start looking at data, it can make your brain think, oh, there's a small group. Oh, there's a small group. There's my reteaching group. But when we really focus on better whole group instruction, that's when we can see a bigger effect. So really going back and looking at your whole group instruction first, and then start thinking about your breakout groups.
Yeah, absolutely. At the school I was at last, we would always talk about the first teach being the most important teach. It's the first time kids are getting the content, and it's our opportunity to deliver it in a way that most kids are going to get it. They'll get that first teach just one time, which points to, like in our last session where we talked about rehearsing ahead of time, getting the words in our mouth before we try them on kids, so that that first teach and whole group is really as best as it can be, so we don't have to go back and remediate as much after. They're getting a lot from the whole group. Awesome. What else? Let's call out some of the patterns that we saw. What are the patterns we saw in this data for students or for the categories of from the assessment?
We noticed that that they struggled with identifying with the grammar, with identifying a noun, and then the teacher kind of attributed that to having to skip some grammar lessons, which brought up as a principal my question, a question about pacing and how do we balance staying on pace, or keeping up with pacing, and I don't even want to say ensuring mastery because that's not possible, but where do we draw that line so that we're not waiting for everybody to catch up, and there are so many kids who in that class who are getting it and moving along, so we don't want to bore them and limit their learning just because other students are not there. So I don't know that, you know, in the reading, she ends with that to me, that's a whole interesting topic of discussion with, you know, she had to cut those lessons. So that's why she felt the students didn't perform well.
Yeah, I think that is such a tricky dance to address in individual classrooms and across schools and districts. We know that in order for kids to be successful, they have to have that grade level content, and we have to address the gaps where we see them. And so I think, in thinking back to our first session, and even in what Ms. Williams is doing here, we see this push and pull of, you know, four or five of my kids need some reteach or some remediation, and so I'll address that for reading, diagraphs, and spellings and comprehension, and almost my whole class needs help with identifying nouns. So how can I build in that practice? Where are there opportunities and what's coming up to build in some practice there? Where is there a skill that they are really doing well with, where I can refocus on what they're not mastering? Or can I look ahead into the scope and sequence and see another place where we'll work on identifying nouns or something similar where I can build in more practice? And so I think you're right. It's not as simple as like, okay, we have to stop and do this unit again or whatever, which is what makes our job so tricky and also so powerful for so many kids. Awesome. Thank you for engaging in that first breakout group. I find that on Zooms, whether I'm talking to my family or talking for work, being in a small group is preferable. So I hope that you're really able to take advantage of those times. So like you guys said in your breakout groups and on here, we know that there is a small group of students who is struggling with the reading, diagraphs, and spellings and comprehension, and then a much larger group of students who needs help with identifying nouns. And so we might address those two things in different ways. All right, now we are going to get to look at that small group of students who it appears really struggled with most of the content in Unit 2 and dive into what those gaps might actually be. So we're going to look really closely at the work of those students on the next page of your note catcher. We are going to work to identify the skills that they're struggling with so that we can really target our reteach at very specific skills, not, okay, they did bad on the Unit 2 assessment, we need to reteach them everything in Unit 2, but is there one thing that this kid is struggling with, or two things that this kid is struggling with that I can target in their instruction? So I will put the instructions in the chat because I heard many of you say, wait, I can't remember exactly what the prompt is, but in our next round of breakout groups, we are going to look at page 5 in your guided notes, where you see the actual mistakes that kids were making on the first section of the assessment. So at the bottom of the page, you see the students who we highlighted as needing some more help, and we see the mistakes that they made in the parentheses. The circled answer is the correct answer for the assessment, and then the mistake is what's written next to the number. So like for Noah on question number 1, he circled bit when the correct answer was byte. So we're going to look to see trends in individual student data and what we actually need to address to fill those gaps for students. So we're going to take again about 15 minutes in our breakout groups where we identify trends and what we need to address in our small groups for these students. And let me put those instructions in the chat before I send you back into your breakout groups. All right. All right, so I'm going to send you back to breakout groups. I'll bring us back. No need to come back any earlier than when your timer runs out and it says everybody's going back to the main group. Again, I'll pop around into groups just to make sure we're doing okay, but please keep going with your conversation. All right, so as we're all making our way back to the main group, let's start chatting out. What patterns did we see in individual student errors? Or if you prefer coming off mute. And let's see how specific we can get. Yeah, we see lots of students are having an issue with some of the long vowel spellings. We can see for specific students, there's super targeted errors with Noah, the A consonant E, and I consonant E, Alejandro, I consonant E, Crystal, E, and then we have Amanda, who seems to have unfinished learning across multiple things and multiple vowel patterns, and probably needs some more targeted instruction. Okay, before we finish out on our data meeting, I wanted to point our attention to the last piece that they did at this school. And this is page 6 on your handout. This is where Miss William really reflects on her teaching, what she saw in her classroom throughout this unit. We don't have quite as much time as I was hoping for to go into her reflections. So let's just take 2 minutes to review what her reflections on page 6 and chat out what we noticed about what she was thinking. And think about, why is it important that we take this step? We can't just look at the data that we collected from the assessment. Why is this step so important for us? So as you're finishing up reading Miss Williams' reflections, think, why would this step be important to her and her team in thinking about what students need in her classroom? And then go ahead and chat out your reflections. Yeah, she's really thinking about what she did how it impacted students, what she could do to better meet their needs. Knowing, oh yeah, these kids missed this thing on this day, or I cut these lessons on this day. That's probably why they didn't get it. Awesome. Thank you so much for these reflections. We are now going to move on into our wrapping up, quick wrapping up section. I know we just have about 5 minutes left. So we're going to quickly reflect to ourselves. We have prompts on the next page in our guided notes, page 7. To what extent is this work currently happening at your school? And again, thinking really bite-sized. What's one action you may take based on what we've learned today at your school? So you can reflect in your guided notes. If you want to share them in the chat, that's great too. But this can be private for you or public. And then before our next session, which is in about another month, we have a little bit of action to engage in at our schools. If you're a school-based leader or teacher, collaborate to lead a data meeting. It can be with a single teacher, it could be with a team of teachers or a grade level, whatever makes sense to you in your context. And it should be focused on the foundational reading skills. And then if you're a district leader, observe a data meeting focused on the foundational reading skills at one of the schools you serve. In our next session, we will be coming back to this same data set, these same students, and think about how we can respond to the data to ensure that all of our students are closing the gaps they have in foundational skills to be able to move in into and master grade level instruction. And then as always, we so appreciate your feedback for me as your facilitator, for our team in developing the content. So I'm going to drop the link to our survey, or you can type in that tiny URL. And please complete the survey before you leave here today. And then as soon as you're finished, you are free to go about your day. Again, thank you so much for spending this hour and a half with us. I know you'll have about 1.5 million things to do at all moments as educators in schools. So thanks so much for taking this hour and a half to be here with us. And we will see you in about a month to do our 3rd session together. I'll hang out here for 5 or 6 more minutes before closing out the session in case anybody has any questions. Hi, Abby.
I figured I wanted to make sure you didn't jump off before I asked my questions. I
Yeah.
can ask. I work at NDE,
Okay.
grading specialist, and I just didn't know who to ask, so I thought, well, I'll just ask you right now since you would know whether.
Yeah, I would ask, have you worked with Amanda at all?
Yeah.
Yeah, I would ask her.
Okay, that's fine.
And you could always keep Ethan on there too. I think that would be fine too.
Okay. Yeah, I just thought I had forgotten that you guys were getting feedback from all these sessions. So I thought it might be a good idea for us to have that data also to help us think about what do we need to do? What other things do we need to do to support the schools? So this was a good session. The breakout room was really good.
Awesome. I'm so glad. I know. I love the breakout rooms.
Yeah.
It makes people feel so much more comfortable to just talk and share.
Yeah, in that group that we were just working with, they're a really sharp group.
Awesome.
So, and now who do you do this with again next? Or when do you do this again next?
I do it again at 10:30. And I'm not sure where they are or if they're coming from the same school. It's just 6 people. So it's a really small group.
Yeah. I know, I can't remember. I just signed up for this because it was the beginning of the day. Yeah, and even the groups were like, who are you? You know, not everybody knows I work with them either. They're like, who are you?
Yeah.
It's a little bit awkward because I'm, giving, you guys are developing, and then Marissa and I are giving feedback on this session.
Okay.
Like working with Amanda.
Yeah.
So, and then you deliver it. So it's kind of like.
Yeah. And if you have direct feedback for me too, please let me know.
There was a slide that had a couple typos on it. I know you fixed one of them. Did
the
you
one
fix the one that Mark read? But there was another one. The question about the teacher was worded oddly. You want to just pull it up?
Let me see. Miss Williams or Mr. Landry?
I think Mr. Can you read that question again?
What do we see in Mr. Landry's practices that do not align to best practices in assessment?
Okay.
Does not align.
Okay.
So I just fixed that.
Okay. There was when I read it, I'm like, why am I rereading this again? It seemed a little grammatically off.
Yeah, for sure. I know. We try to catch everything, and then when somebody says it out loud, it's like, oh my gosh.
I know. And then I cringe, and I'm like, no.
Yeah.
No, it was not a big deal at all. But I'm like, hey, if you're doing it again, you might as well fix it now.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. I know there was a couple of things that I fixed along the way.
Yeah, no, not a big deal. But the content definitely. And it was interesting because like OPS, they are implementing a new curriculum I don't know a lot about. And it sounds,
what it's called?
I should know because we talk about it all the time, but I can't remember. I want to say it's not into reading. I don't know, but they just, I know you mentioned Amira. They just implemented Amira, and we approved it as their screening.
Yeah.
And now I'm having second thoughts about it.
Okay. I've heard, I was at a district at the beginning of this year, and we were just trying to figure out like what's the most efficient use of teachers' time and will get us the information we need. And a lot of people mentioned Amir, and I know a huge charter district here is using it and really likes it. But it was like at the beginning of the year, everybody is sort of scrambling to figure out, and none of us really know. So that could be old data that I have, anecdotal data that I have.
Well, we approved it. It wasn't on our approved list, but we approved it for OPS. Pandemic, we made a pandemic decision. And now I need to figure out, was it the right decision? It sounded like my little group was grappling with Amira in kindergarten. But I said, well, its intended purpose is to be a screener. So is it screening? But then they want it to be used for, to be able to get other data.
Yeah.
So I wasn't able to get at what their struggle was with kindergarten. And then I broke out of the room too early. So I thought maybe you might have an insight into Amira.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, we did a number of things, including like using Nearpod quizzes where you could like, the teacher can read the instructions and sort of walk them through it, just to, it's that fine line of, okay, especially for kids, I mean, obviously for kids who are virtual, like, I have you on the screen right now. I want to teach you things, but I also know that I need to assess you, but I don't want to waste our time, like our precious time together. And so definitely, like, I think it makes sense to find these middle of the road, or like these middle grounds for now,
Mhm.
knowing that this is hopefully not
Yeah.
going to last that much longer. And then once we get back full time into schools, really taking a step back and being like, this was a pandemic fix.
Yeah, yeah. And I'm ahead. I want to go, okay, now what are we going to do about assess? Now you all are muddling about, we approved Amira
Yeah.
that they could deliver it virtually, but someday we're going to get out of this. And so I want to ensure that we have good screeners per the
Yeah.
law. It's not, and then where do we
Yeah.
go from there? So, and what state are you in?
I'm in Texas.
Okay.
Yeah. So different, but the same.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Most of our schools are back full-time, but not OPS, not our largest district,
Yeah.
but across the state, most schools are not remote,
Okay. Yeah. Here
which
it's
is
still
unique to, I mean, it really is, more
Yeah.
unique than other states. It is just OPS that's been remote, and they actually just went back full-time this week.
Oh, wow.
But like my kids have been in school, since the beginning.
Yeah. Yeah. Here, all schools had to offer in person. And so there have been kids in person since September or October. Now I can't remember, but there's still just a lot of kids who are opting to stay.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Man,
Yeah.
I keep saying year, but more than year.
I know. Yep.
All right.
So,
Well,
all
thank
right.
you.
Well, thank you. And I'll just email Amanda,
Yeah.
take it off your plate. So,
Okay. Thanks so
Okay.
much.
thanks.
Have
Good
a
luck
great
with the next
one.
session. I'm sure it'll
Okay.
be great. All right. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.